The radio crackled with static as Captain Sarah Chen's voice cut through the chaos. Tower, this is Black Hawk 77. I'm coming in hot with no instruments, no hydraulics, and half my tail rotor missing. On the ground below, a crowd of seasoned pilots stood frozen, watching what they believed would be the final moments of the rookie they'd spent months dismissing. The same woman they'd laughed at during training. The same pilot they'd called too small and too soft for combat aviation. But as the damaged helicopter descended through thick smoke toward an impossible landing zone no bigger than a basketball court, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Something that would silence every doubter and rewrite the rules of what's possible when skill meets unbreakable determination. This is the true story of the pilot who turned mockery into legend in just 7 minutes of flying that defied every law of physics and probability. Sarah Chun stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her entire life proving people wrong. At 26 years old, she was the youngest pilot ever accepted into the elite Black Hawk training program at Fort Rucker, Alabama. More importantly, she was one of only 3 women in a class of 47 pilots. The other cadets noticed her immediately, but not for the reasons she hoped. During the first week of training, whispers followed her everywhere she went. In the mess hall, veteran instructors would glance her way and shake their heads. During flight simulations, her classmates would place bets on how long she'd last before washing out. "She's too small to handle the stick in rough weather," muttered Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a former Navy pilot with 15 years of experience. Blackhawks aren't toys. When you're pulling 4GS in combat conditions, you need real strength. Captain Rodriguez, the lead instructor, was even more direct during the first evaluation meeting. "Chun, I've seen your test scores. You're academically excellent, but flying helicopters in combat isn't about book knowledge. It's about physical capability, mental toughness, and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure." Sarah listened to every word without flinching. She had heard similar doubts her entire life. Growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown, she was the daughter of immigrants who ran a small restaurant. Her parents had sacrificed everything to send her to college, expecting her to become a doctor or engineer. Instead, she fell in love with aviation during a career fair demonstration. "Flying makes me feel alive," she had told her parents when she announced her military plans. "It's the only thing I've ever been passionate about." Her father, Chen Wei, had been skeptical. "The military is no place for small girls who dream too big," he said in Mandarin, believing his daughter wouldn't understand. But Sarah understood every word perfectly, just as she understood the doubt in everyone's eyes when she walked into the training facility each morning. The first month of Black Hawk training was brutal. The UH-60 helicopter weighs 11,000 pounds empty and can carry another 9,000 pounds of cargo or personnel. Learning to maneuver such a massive machine requires not just physical strength, but an almost supernatural sense of spatial awareness and timing. During basic hovering exercises, Sarah struggled initially. The other pilots smirked as they watched her fight the controls, the helicopter wobbling uncertainly as she tried to maintain steady flight. Instructor Captain Williams called her performance adequate at best during the weekly review. "Adequate won't keep your crew alive in Afghanistan," he said bluntly. "If you can't master these fundamentals, you'll never make it to advanced combat training." But Sarah had a secret weapon that none of her critics knew about. Every night after official training ended, she would sneak back to the simulator bay. While her classmates were drinking beer and complaining about the difficulty of the program, she was practicing emergency procedures, studying mechanical systems, and running through challenging scenarios until her eyes burned from fatigue. Her roommate, Lieutenant Amy Foster, found her there one night at 2 in the morning, still working through a particularly difficult auto-rotation landing simulation. "Sarah, you've been here for 6 hours, Amy said, concerned. "You need to sleep." "I need to be better," Sarah replied without looking away from the controls. "Everyone expects me to fail. I can't give them the satisfaction." Amy sat down beside her. "You know, trying to prove everyone wrong is exhausting. Maybe you should just focus on proving yourself right." This advice stuck with Sarah more than any criticism she had received. The next morning, something had changed in her approach. Instead of flying defensively, worried about making mistakes, she began flying with genuine confidence. Her movements became smoother, more intuitive. The helicopter stopped feeling like an opponent and started feeling like a partner. Lieutenant Morrison was the first to notice the transformation. During a complex formation flying exercise, Sarah executed a perfect tactical approach that impressed even the instructors. Her Black Hawk moved through the air with grace that seemed impossible for such a large aircraft. Where did that come from? Morrison asked during the debriefing. Practice, Sarah answered simply. But her improved flying skills only seemed to increase the resentment from some of her classmates. During week 6 of training, the real sabotage began. Someone had been tampering with her equipment, loosening connections in her flight helmet, and adjusting her seat settings between training sessions. Small things, but dangerous enough to affect her performance during crucial evaluations. Sarah discovered the sabotage when her radio cut out during a critical communication exercise. She had managed to complete the mission using hand signals and perfect tactical positioning, but the incident made her realize that some people would go to extreme lengths to see her fail. Instead of reporting the incident, she decided to handle it her own way. She began arriving at the training facility an hour earlier each day, carefully checking every piece of equipment before flying. She also started carrying a small toolkit, making sure her gear was always properly configured. The extra vigilance paid off when she caught Lieutenant Bradley Thompson in the act of adjusting her flight controls. Thompson was a veteran pilot from Texas who had made no secret of his belief that women didn't belong in combat aviation. "You've got some nerve," Sarah said quietly, surprising him in the hangar bay. Thompson straightened up, showing no shame. "You don't belong here, Chun. Some of us are trying to save lives by preventing unqualified pilots from getting into combat situations. My qualification scores are higher than yours in every category except one," Sarah replied calmly. "And that's only because you're cheating." Thompson stepped closer, trying to intimidate her with his size. "Scores don't mean anything when bullets are flying, and your crew is depending on you to get them home alive." Sarah looked up at him without backing down. "You're right about one thing. When people are depending on me, I'll get them home. That's a promise." The confrontation was witnessed by Captain Rodriguez, who had been conducting late-night equipment inspections. Thompson was immediately removed from the program, but the damage to Sarah's reputation was already done. Word spread quickly that she had caused trouble for a veteran pilot. The remaining weeks of basic training became even more challenging. Some instructors seemed to grade her more harshly, looking for any excuse to criticize her performance. During the final evaluation exercise, she was assigned the most difficult scenario in the training program, a simulated rescue mission in hostile territory with multiple system failures. As Sarah prepared for the evaluation flight that would determine whether she advanced to combat training, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her parents, who still didn't understand her career choice, but supported her anyway. She thought about Amy Foster, who had become her closest friend and strongest supporter. Most of all, she thought about all the people who were counting on her to fail. The evaluating instructor was Colonel Patricia Hayes, a legendary pilot with 30 years of experience and a reputation for absolute fairness. Hayes had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts and was known for producing some of the finest helicopter pilots in military history. "Chun," Colonel Hayes said before the evaluation began, "I've been watching your progress throughout this program. You've faced more obstacles than most cadets, but you've also shown more determination than anyone I've seen in years. Today isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about proving that you have what it takes to save lives in the worst possible circumstances." As Sarah strapped herself into the Black Hawk for her final evaluation, she felt a calmness she had never experienced before. All the doubt, all the criticism, all the sabotage had forged her into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The helicopter lifted off into a gray Alabama sky, carrying not just a pilot seeking to prove herself, but a young woman who was about to demonstrate that greatness comes in all sizes, and that the strongest people are often those who refuse to accept the limitations others try to place on them. Little did anyone know that this evaluation flight would be just the beginning of a story that would eventually redefine what it means to be an exceptional pilot under impossible circumstances. Colonel Hayes watched through her binoculars as Sarah's Black Hawk disappeared into the simulated combat zone. The evaluation exercise was designed to test every skill a pilot would need in actual warfare: low-level navigation through hostile territory, emergency medical evacuation under fire, and system failure management while maintaining mission objectives. 20 minutes into the exercise, Sarah's radio crackled with the first emergency scenario. "Black Hawk 77, this is ground control. You have wounded personnel at grid reference 245 to 867. Be advised, enemy forces are in the area, and your hydraulic system has just failed. In the control room, Other instructors leaned forward to watch Sarah's response on their monitors. Hydraulic failure in a Black Hawk makes the aircraft incredibly difficult to control, requiring enormous physical strength and perfect technique to maintain stable flight. Sarah's voice came through the radio calm and professional. Copy, ground control. Proceeding to extraction point. Hydraulics are offline, switching to manual controls. What the instructors couldn't see was the intense physical effort required to fly the helicopter without hydraulic assistance. Every control input had to be forced through pure muscle power. Sarah's arms burned as she fought to keep the aircraft steady, but her voice never betrayed the strain. She reached the extraction point exactly on schedule, despite having to navigate through a complex obstacle course while managing the disabled aircraft. The precision landing she executed in the confined space drew murmurs of approval from the evaluation team. Outstanding technique, muttered Captain Rodriguez. She's making that look easier than it should be. But the real test came during the extraction itself. As Sarah's crew chief began loading the simulated wounded, the exercise controllers introduced a new complication: incoming enemy fire and a sudden weather change that reduced visibility to nearly zero. Most pilots in training would abort the mission at this point, calling for backup or requesting permission to return to base. Sarah chose a different approach. She used the helicopter's downwash to clear the dust and smoke around the landing zone, creating a temporary window of visibility. Then, while maintaining perfect hover control with failed hydraulics, she used her aircraft's positioning to shield the extraction team from the simulated enemy fire. "How is she doing that?" whispered Lieutenant Foster, who was observing the exercise. "The helicopter should be uncontrollable in these conditions." Colonel Hayes smiled for the first time that day. "She's not fighting the aircraft. She's working with it. That's the difference between a good pilot and an exceptional one." The extraction was completed flawlessly, but the evaluation wasn't over. Sarah had to return to base through deteriorating weather conditions while managing multiple system failures and fuel management calculations. She landed exactly on the designated spot, 30 seconds ahead of schedule. After shutting down the engines, Sarah climbed out of the cockpit with sweat-soaked flight gear and hands that were visibly shaking from the physical exertion. But she was smiling. Colonel Hayes approached her with the evaluation results. "Chun, in 30 years of evaluating pilots, I've never seen a more impressive demonstration of technical skill, physical capability, and mental resilience. You've not only passed this evaluation, you've set a new standard for excellence in this program." The other cadets who had spent months doubting her abilities stood in stunned silence as Sarah was officially advanced to combat training with the highest marks in the class. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been her most vocal critic, was the first to congratulate her. "I owe you an apology," he said, extending his hand. "I was wrong about your capabilities. That was exceptional flying." Combat training at Fort Campbell, Kentucky was an entirely different level of difficulty. Sarah found herself working with seasoned pilots who had combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. The training scenarios were based on real missions, using actual intelligence reports and tactical situations that had resulted in casualties. Her flight instructor was Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Johnson, a 20-year veteran who had flown more than 300 combat missions. Johnson was known for his brutal honesty and his ability to identify which pilots had what it took to survive in combat. "Chun," he said during their first meeting, "I don't care about your gender, your size, or your test scores. I only care about one thing. Can you bring your crew home alive when everything goes wrong? Because in combat, everything always goes wrong." The first month of combat training focused on tactical flying in hostile environments. Sarah learned to navigate using terrain features while avoiding enemy radar, to coordinate with ground forces during active firefights, and to perform medical evacuations while under direct attack. Her small size, which had been considered a weakness, actually became an advantage in combat training. She could fit into confined spaces that larger pilots couldn't access, and her precise control touch was perfect for the delicate maneuvers required in urban combat environments. During a particularly challenging exercise, Sarah was tasked with inserting special operations troops into a simulated enemy compound. The landing zone was surrounded by obstacles, and enemy forces were programmed to respond aggressively to any aircraft in the area. As she approached the target, her aircraft came under heavy simulated fire. Instead of pulling back to a safer distance, Sarah used advanced evasive techniques she had developed during her extensive practice sessions. She flew the Black Hawk through a series of rapid altitude changes and directional shifts that made it nearly impossible for enemy forces to track her. "Jesus Christ," muttered one of the special operations soldiers in the back of the helicopter. "She's flying this thing like a fighter jet." Sarah completed the insertion perfectly, dropping the troops exactly where they needed to be and extracting without taking any simulated damage. Chief Johnson, who had been monitoring the exercise from the ground, was impressed despite himself. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" he asked during the debriefing. "I practiced every scenario I could imagine," Sarah replied, "and some I hoped I'd never encounter." Her reputation began to spread throughout the special operations community. Experienced soldiers who had flown with multiple pilots began specifically requesting her for training exercises. Her call sign, Phoenix, was earned during a particularly difficult rescue simulation where she had managed to extract a downed aircrew from what should have been an impossible location. But Sarah's real test came during the final exercise before deployment qualification. She was assigned to lead a 4-helicopter formation on a complex mission that involved inserting troops, providing close air support, conducting a medical evacuation, and extracting all personnel while enemy forces attempted to prevent the mission's success. The exercise was designed to last 6 hours and involved multiple phases of increasing difficulty. Sarah's leadership abilities would be tested as much as her flying skills, since she would be responsible for coordinating the actions of 4 different aircraft and their crews. From the beginning, things went wrong. One of the helicopters in her formation experienced mechanical problems that forced it to return to base early. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly, reducing visibility and creating dangerous wind conditions. Enemy forces proved more aggressive than expected, forcing constant tactical adjustments. Sarah adapted to each challenge with calm professionalism that impressed even the most experienced observers. When her formation came under attack during the troop insertion, she used creative positioning to provide cover for the other aircraft while completing her own mission objectives. When the medical evacuation became complicated by the loss of radio contact with ground forces, she used visual signals and tactical knowledge to locate the casualties and complete the rescue. The most challenging moment came during the extraction phase. Enemy forces had surrounded the landing zone, making a conventional approach impossible. The other pilots in the formation were ready to abort the mission and request additional support. Sarah had a different idea. Using her knowledge of the Black Hawk's capabilities and her understanding of enemy tactics, she developed an extraction plan that involved using the terrain itself as cover. She led her formation through a low-level approach that kept them hidden until the last possible moment, then executed a rapid insertion and extraction that gave the enemy forces no time to respond effectively. "That was the most innovative tactical flying I've ever seen," Chief Johnson told the evaluation committee afterward. "Chen didn't just complete the mission. She redefined how we think about helicopter operations in contested airspace." When the final scores were announced, Sarah had not only qualified for combat deployment, she had achieved the highest overall rating in the history of the program. More importantly, she had earned the respect and trust of pilots and soldiers who would soon depend on her skills in real combat situations. As she prepared for deployment to Afghanistan, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from the uncertain rookie who had arrived at Fort Rucker 18 months earlier. The critics and doubters had been silenced, but she knew the real test was still ahead. In combat, there would be no simulations, no second chances, and no room for error. But she was ready. All the training, all the criticism, all the extra hours of practice had prepared her for whatever challenges she might face. She was no longer trying to prove herself to anyone else. She knew exactly what she was capable of, and she was eager to put those capabilities to use in service of something greater than personal achievement. The deployment orders came through on a Friday afternoon in late spring. Sarah Chun, now Captain Chun, would be leading a Black Hawk unit in Afghanistan's most dangerous province. Her mission: provide air support for special operations forces conducting high-risk missions against enemy targets. As she packed her gear for deployment, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. Every obstacle had made her stronger. Every doubt had driven her to become better. Every challenge had revealed capabilities she didn't know she possessed. Little did she know that her greatest test was still waiting for her, hidden in the mountains of Afghanistan where skill, courage, and determination would be pushed beyond their absolute limits. The helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan's Khost province just as the sun disappeared behind the jagged mountains that surrounded the base. Captain Sarah Chin stepped out of the transport aircraft into the thin, dusty air that would be her environment for the next 12 months. Chapman was located in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan, where enemy forces controlled significant territory and regularly attacked coalition forces. The base itself had been the target of numerous rocket and mortar attacks, and helicopter operations were considered among the most hazardous assignments in the theater. Sarah's new unit, the 3rd Battalion, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, was legendary among military aviation circles. Known as the Night Stalkers, they provided helicopter support for the most dangerous special operations missions in Afghanistan. Their motto, "Night Stalkers Don't Quit," reflected the unit's reputation for completing missions that other units considered impossible. Lieutenant Colonel David Martinez, the unit commander, met Sarah at the landing zone. Martinez was a veteran of 3 combat deployments and had personally flown more than 500 combat missions. His weathered face and steady demeanor reflected the stress of leading pilots in one of the world's most dangerous combat environments. "Captain Chun," he said, shaking her hand firmly, "your reputation precedes you. I've read your training reports, and I've spoken with Chief Johnson about your capabilities. We need exceptional pilots here, and based on what I've heard, you fit that description." Sarah looked around the base, taking in the concrete barriers, guard towers, and constant activity that marked a forward combat outpost. "I'm ready to contribute, however. You need me, sir." Martinez smiled grimly. "You'll get that opportunity sooner than you might expect. We've got a mission briefing in 1 hour. You'll be flying as co-pilot with Captain Steve Wilson on a reconnaissance mission tonight. Wilson has been here 8 months and knows the area better than anyone." Captain Wilson turned out to be a soft-spoken pilot from Montana who had earned a reputation for completing missions in the worst possible weather conditions. During the briefing, he explained the challenges of flying in Afghanistan's mountainous terrain. "The altitude here affects everything," he said, pointing to a topographical map. "We operate at elevations where the air is so thin that helicopters perform completely differently. What seems like a routine maneuver at sea level becomes extremely dangerous up here." The reconnaissance mission that night was Sarah's introduction to combat operations. Flying without lights through mountainous terrain while enemy forces actively searched for coalition aircraft required skills that no training program could fully replicate. As they flew through valleys so narrow that the rotor blades seemed to almost touch the rocky walls, Sarah began to understand why Afghanistan had earned its reputation as the graveyard of aircraft. The combination of high altitude, unpredictable weather, and hostile terrain created conditions that pushed helicopters and pilots to their absolute limits. "The mountains here will kill you faster than enemy fire," Wilson explained over the intercom. "Weather changes instantly, air currents are unpredictable, and there are very few places to land safely if something goes wrong." 3 weeks into her deployment, Sarah was assigned her own aircraft and crew. Her Black Hawk, designated Phoenix 77, was a battle-tested aircraft that had survived numerous combat missions. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, was a 15-year veteran who had worked on helicopters in 3 different combat zones. "This bird has been through hell and back," Rodriguez told Sarah during their first inspection. "She's been shot up, crashed twice, and rebuilt from spare parts. But she'll get you home if you treat her right." Sarah's first mission as aircraft commander was a medical evacuation in the Karengal Valley, an area so dangerous that it was known among troops as the Valley of Death. A soldier had been seriously wounded during a firefight, and conventional ground evacuation was impossible due to enemy forces controlling the access roads. The mission briefing was sobering. The landing zone was on a mountainside at 8,000 feet elevation, surrounded by enemy positions, and accessible only through a narrow canyon that provided no room for evasive maneuvers. "This is a high-risk mission," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez explained. "Enemy forces know we'll attempt evacuation, and they'll be waiting for us. The approach is through terrain that offers no alternative routes if we come under fire." As Phoenix 77 lifted off into the Afghan darkness, Sarah felt the familiar combination of adrenaline and focus that marked the beginning of a dangerous mission. Her crew was depending on her to get them safely to the objective and back home again. The flight to the Karengal Valley took 45 minutes, navigating through mountain passes while monitoring radio communications from ground forces engaging enemy fighters. As they approached the landing zone, tracer rounds began streaking past their aircraft. Taking fire from multiple positions, called out her door gunner, Specialist James Thompson. "Enemy forces on the ridgeline to our east and south." Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. Instead of approaching the landing zone directly, she used the mountainous terrain to mask her approach, flying through valleys that provided natural cover from enemy fire. When she finally emerged at the landing zone, she positioned the aircraft so that the helicopter's armored sections provided maximum protection for the medical team loading the wounded soldier. The evacuation took less than 90 seconds, but enemy fire was intense throughout the entire operation. As Phoenix 77 lifted off with the wounded soldier, multiple rocket-propelled grenades exploded near the aircraft, filling the air with shrapnel and debris. "Outstanding work," radioed the ground commander as they departed the area. That was textbook flying under impossible conditions. But Sarah knew that the mission wasn't complete until the wounded soldier was safely delivered to the medical facility at Bagram Air Base. Flying at night through mountains while carrying a critically injured patient required maintaining perfect stability and timing to prevent further injury. The flight to Bagram took 2 hours, during which Sarah demonstrated the precise control and smooth flying technique that would become her trademark. The medical team later reported that her flying had been so steady that they were able to perform advanced medical procedures during the flight, potentially saving the soldier's life. Word of Sarah's capabilities spread quickly throughout the special operations community. Within 6 weeks of her arrival, she was regularly assigned to the most challenging missions, earning a reputation for completing evacuations and insertions that other pilots considered too dangerous to attempt. Her defining moment came during Operation Mountain Strike, a complex mission designed to capture a high-value enemy target in the remote mountains near the Pakistani border. The operation involved inserting special operations teams at multiple locations simultaneously, requiring precise timing and coordination between 4 different aircraft. Every pilot needs to be prepared to adapt instantly to changing conditions. The insertion began at midnight, with Sarah leading a formation of 4 Black Hawks through the mountain pass toward the target area. As they approached the enemy positions, the night sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire from multiple locations. "Heavy flak from all directions," reported Captain Wilson, flying in the second aircraft. "This is worse than intelligence predicted." Sarah's response demonstrated why she had earned her reputation as an exceptional pilot. Instead of following the planned approach route, she improvised a new flight path that used the mountainous terrain to provide natural cover from enemy fire. Her innovative routing allowed the formation to reach the insertion points without taking significant damage. The insertion itself was flawless, with all special operations teams delivered exactly where they needed to be despite the intense enemy resistance. But as the helicopters departed the area, Sarah's aircraft began experiencing electrical problems that threatened to leave them stranded in enemy territory. "Phoenix 77, we're showing multiple system failures on your aircraft," radioed the Mission Control Center. "Can you maintain flight?" Sarah quickly assessed the damage. Her navigation systems were failing, communications were intermittent, and several flight control systems were operating erratically. Normal procedure would be to abort the mission and attempt an emergency landing at the nearest coalition base. But Sarah knew that leaving the special operations teams without air support would put their lives at serious risk. Instead of aborting, she chose to continue the mission using manual flight control techniques and backup systems that most pilots had never needed to use in actual combat. For the next 4 hours, she provided air support and overwatch for the ground teams while flying an aircraft that should have been grounded for maintenance. Her precise flying and tactical decision-making enabled the special operations teams to complete their mission successfully, capturing the target and gathering critical intelligence. The extraction phase proved even more challenging. Weather conditions had deteriorated, reducing visibility to near zero, and enemy reinforcements had arrived at the compound. Sarah had to navigate through mountainous terrain using only basic instruments while coordinating the extraction of multiple teams under enemy fire. Her performance during this mission established her as one of the finest combat pilots in the regiment. The special operations team she had supported specifically requested her for future missions, and other pilots began studying her techniques to improve their own capabilities. But Sarah's greatest challenge was still waiting for her, hidden in an ordinary mission that would test every skill she had developed and push her abilities beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. A routine reconnaissance flight that would become legendary throughout military aviation circles, proving once and for all that exceptional pilots aren't defined by their size or background, but by their skill, courage, and refusal to accept defeat. The morning of September 15th began like any other day at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Captain Sarah Chun was scheduled for what appeared to be a routine reconnaissance mission in the Spingar Mountains, an area where intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity near the Pakistani border. Her crew that morning consisted of 3 experienced professionals: Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez as crew chief, Specialist James Thompson as door gunner, and First Lieutenant Michael Brooks as co-pilot. Brooks was relatively new to combat operations, having arrived at Chapman only 6 weeks earlier, but his training scores had been excellent, and Sarah was confident in his abilities. The mission briefing was conducted by Captain Wilson, who had flown similar reconnaissance flights in the area multiple times. Intelligence indicates possible enemy supply routes through the mountain passes, he explained, pointing to aerial photographs of the rugged terrain. Your mission is to conduct visual reconnaissance and report any suspicious activity. Weather conditions were reported as marginal, with scattered clouds and moderate winds. Mountain weather in Afghanistan was notoriously unpredictable, but the forecasters predicted conditions would remain stable throughout the morning. The flight should take about 3 hours, Wilson continued. Standard reconnaissance pattern through the valleys, maintaining sufficient altitude to avoid small arms fire. Radio check-ins every 30 minutes with base operations. As Phoenix 77 lifted off at 0800 hours, Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction of a smoothly running aircraft. The Black Hawk was performing perfectly, all systems functioning normally, and visibility was good despite the scattered cloud cover. The flight to the reconnaissance area took 45 minutes, passing over terrain that Sarah had become familiar with during her previous missions. The mountains of Afghanistan still impressed her with their stark beauty and dangerous remoteness. Villages and roads were scattered sparsely through valleys that seemed untouched by modern civilization. Phoenix 77, this is Overwatch, came the radio call from the surveillance aircraft providing support for their mission. We're showing clear skies in your operating area. No indication of enemy activity at this time. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began the systematic reconnaissance pattern that would take them through 4 different mountain valleys. The mission was proceeding exactly according to plan when everything suddenly went wrong. It started with a sound that no pilot ever wants to hear, the sharp crack of metal breaking under stress. Sarah felt it through the aircraft's controls before she heard it, a vibration that indicated something critical had failed. "Did you feel that?" asked Lieutenant Brooks, his voice tight with concern. Before Sarah could respond, the aircraft shuddered violently and began pulling hard to the right. Through her headset, she could hear Staff Sergeant Rodriguez shouting from the cabin. "Tail rotor failure. We're losing tail rotor authority." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. Tail rotor failure in a helicopter is one of the most dangerous mechanical emergencies possible. Without the tail rotor to counteract the main rotor's torque, the aircraft would begin spinning uncontrollably, making flight impossible and often resulting in a fatal crash. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Sarah transmitted over the radio. Phoenix 77 declaring emergency. Tail rotor failure at 8,000 feet, approximately 20 miles northeast of Chapman. The response from base operations was immediate. Phoenix 77, copy your mayday. Search and rescue assets are being scrambled. What is your status? Sarah was fighting the controls with every ounce of her strength, using engine power management and cyclic control inputs to prevent the aircraft from entering an uncontrollable spin. The techniques she was employing required perfect timing and precise control inputs that few pilots had ever mastered. Attempting controlled flight with partial tail rotor authority, she radioed. Crew of 4 souls on board. Will attempt emergency landing. But finding a suitable landing area in the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan was nearly impossible. The valleys were too narrow for a safe approach, the slopes too steep for landing, and most flat areas were either too small or too far away to reach with a damaged aircraft. Lieutenant Brooks was studying the emergency checklist, his voice steady despite the extreme circumstances. Emergency procedures call for immediate auto-rotation to the nearest suitable landing area. Sarah knew the procedures as well as anyone, but she also knew that following standard emergency protocols in this situation would likely result in a crash landing that could kill her entire crew. The mountainous terrain simply didn't offer the long, flat approach path that auto-rotation required. Instead, she made a decision that violated every conventional wisdom about helicopter emergency procedures. Rather than attempting an immediate landing, she chose to continue flying while looking for a better landing option. even though this meant operating the aircraft in conditions that should have made flight impossible. Rodriguez, how much structural damage can you see? Sarah called to her crew chief. Major damage to the tail rotor assembly, Rodriguez reported after a quick visual inspection. Looks like we've lost about 60% of our tail rotor capability. I can see parts of the rotor hub that are completely destroyed. This information confirmed what Sarah already suspected. They were flying an aircraft that shouldn't have been capable of controlled flight. But her unconventional flying techniques were keeping them airborne, buying precious time to find a better landing option. The strain of flying the damaged helicopter was enormous. Every control input had to be perfectly timed and precisely executed. Sarah's arms and legs burned from the constant physical effort required to maintain even basic flight control. There, Lieutenant Brooks pointed through the cockpit window. Valley opening at 2 o'clock, approximately 5 miles. Looks like there might be a flat area suitable for landing. Sarah turned the aircraft toward the valley Brooks had identified, but the maneuver required flying over a ridgeline that was higher than their current altitude. With a fully functional aircraft, this would have been a simple climb. With their damaged tail rotor, it became an almost impossible challenge. Phoenix 77, this is Overwatch, came the radio transmission. We're tracking your position. Be advised, you're approaching an area where enemy activity has been reported. Recommend avoiding that valley if possible. Sarah faced an impossible choice. The valley ahead offered their best chance for a safe landing, but it was also potentially controlled by enemy forces who would certainly attack a damaged helicopter attempting an emergency landing. The alternative was to continue flying over terrain that offered no landing options while their aircraft became increasingly difficult to control. Copy, Overwatch, Sarah transmitted. No choice but to proceed. Current damage prevents alternative routing. As they approached the ridgeline, the aircraft began experiencing more severe control problems. The partial tail rotor failure was getting worse, and Sarah could feel the helicopter wanting to spin out of control with every gust of wind. We're not going to make it over the ridge, Brooks said, studying their rate of climb against the approaching terrain. Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew there was one technique that might work. It was something she had practiced extensively during her training but had never attempted in an actual aircraft, using the helicopter's momentum and precise power management to execute a tactical climb that would clear the obstacle. Hold on, she warned her crew. This is going to be interesting. What happened next would later be studied by flight instructors as an example of exceptional piloting skill under impossible conditions. Sarah used a combination of forward momentum, cyclic control inputs, and precise power management to essentially jump the helicopter over the ridgeline, trading airspeed for altitude in a maneuver that required perfect timing and extraordinary skill. The technique worked, but barely. Phoenix 77 cleared the ridgeline with less than 50 feet to spare, and Sarah immediately began searching for a landing area in the valley below. What she found was both good news and bad news. There was indeed a flat area suitable for landing, but it was surrounded by rocky terrain and overlooked by positions that could easily conceal enemy fighters. Phoenix 77, this is Overwatch. We're detecting movement in your target area. Multiple heat signatures consistent with armed personnel. Sarah processed this information quickly. Enemy forces in the area meant that a conventional landing would likely result in her crew being captured or killed. But continued flight was becoming impossible as their aircraft systems continued to deteriorate. She made another decision that would define her as an exceptional pilot. Instead of landing immediately, she chose to use the helicopter's remaining capabilities to find a better position, even though this meant flying deeper into potentially hostile territory. Rodriguez, Thompson, prepare for tactical landing in potentially hostile area, she announced to her crew. Brooks, monitor engine parameters and emergency procedures. As Phoenix 77 descended toward the valley floor, enemy muzzle flashes began appearing from multiple positions around the landing area. What had started as a mechanical emergency was now becoming a combat situation that would test every skill Sarah had developed during her months in Afghanistan. The next few minutes would determine whether the rookie pilot who had been laughed at during training had truly become the exceptional aviator that her reputation suggested, or whether the critics who had doubted her capabilities had been right all along. The enemy fire began as scattered shots from concealed positions around the valley floor, but quickly intensified as more fighters emerged from their hiding places. Tracer rounds streaked past Phoenix 77's cockpit as Sarah fought to maintain control of the increasingly unresponsive aircraft. Taking fire from multiple positions, Specialist Thompson reported from his door gun position. Count at least 15 enemy fighters, possibly more. Sarah's mind raced through her tactical options. A conventional landing in the open area would expose her crew to devastating enemy fire. Attempting to continue flying much longer would likely result in complete loss of control as their damaged systems failed entirely. She needed a third option that standard procedures didn't cover. Overwatch, Phoenix 7-7, she transmitted. Request immediate close air support at our position. We're taking heavy fire and need cover for emergency landing. Phoenix 7-7, closest air support is 20 minutes out, came the sobering response. Search and rescue helicopters are 30 minutes behind that. 20 minutes was an eternity in their current situation. Sarah could feel the aircraft becoming more difficult to control with each passing second as the damaged tail rotor assembly continued to deteriorate. Lieutenant Brooks was monitoring their engine parameters, which were also beginning to show signs of stress from the emergency flight conditions. That's when Sarah spotted something that changed everything. A narrow clearing on the opposite side of the valley, barely visible through the smoke, and dust being kicked up by enemy gunfire. The area was too small for a conventional landing, surrounded by rocks and trees that would normally make it unsuitable for helicopter operations. But it was also positioned in a way that would make enemy fire extremely difficult. There, she pointed through the cockpit window. Northwest side of the valley, past those rock formations. Brooks studied the area through his binoculars. Sarah, that's not a landing zone. It's maybe 30 feet wide, surrounded by obstacles, and on uneven ground. A normal aircraft couldn't land there safely. Good thing we're not flying a normal aircraft, Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. What happened next would later be called the 7-minute miracle by military aviation historians. Sarah Chun, flying a severely damaged Black Hawk helicopter under enemy fire in mountainous terrain at high altitude, began executing a series of maneuvers that defied conventional wisdom about what was possible in such circumstances. First, she used the helicopter's damaged condition to her advantage. The partial tail rotor failure that was making the aircraft nearly impossible to control also created unusual flight characteristics that she exploited for evasive maneuvering. By carefully managing power and control inputs, she made Phoenix 7-7 move through the air in patterns that made it extremely difficult for enemy gunners to track. How is she doing that? Thompson wondered aloud as they zigzagged through the valley while enemy fire consistently missed their aircraft. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had worked with dozens of pilots during her 15-year career, had never seen flying like this. She's not fighting the damage, she observed. She's using it. As they approached the tiny landing area Sarah had identified, the true magnitude of what she was attempting became clear. The space was barely large enough for the aircraft's rotor diameter, surrounded by rock formations and trees that left no margin for error. Any mistake in approach angle, timing, or control inputs would result in a catastrophic crash. The approach itself required techniques that weren't taught in any flight manual. Sarah had to descend through a narrow gap between rock formations, then execute a sharp turn while managing the aircraft's tendency to spin due to the damaged tail rotor, all while maintaining precise speed and altitude control in the thin mountain air. Phoenix 7-7, this is Overwatch, came the radio transmission. We're tracking your approach. That landing area appears too confined for safe helicopter operations. Copy, Overwatch, Sarah responded, her voice steady with concentration. Beginning final approach now. What followed was a demonstration of piloting skill that would be studied for years afterward. Sarah threaded the damaged helicopter through the rock formations with inches to spare on either side, compensating for wind gusts and the aircraft's unpredictable handling characteristics through pure instinct and extraordinary spatial awareness. The final descent was the most challenging part. The landing area was on uneven ground that sloped at an angle that would normally make helicopter landing impossible. Sarah had to time her touchdown perfectly, using the aircraft's skids to catch the slope at exactly the right moment while managing the damaged tail rotor's tendency to swing the aircraft around. Touchdown in 10 seconds, she announced to her crew. Brace for hard landing. Phoenix 7-7 touched down with a jarring impact that threw everyone against their restraints, but they were down safely in a position where enemy fire couldn't reach them. The rock formations that had made the landing so dangerous also provided perfect protection from the fighters who were still shooting at their previous position. Outstanding flying, Lieutenant Brooks said, his voice filled with admiration and relief. I've never seen anything like that. But Sarah knew their situation was still extremely dangerous. They were stranded in hostile territory with an aircraft that couldn't fly, surrounded by enemy forces who would soon figure out their location. Their only hope was to hold their position until rescue forces could reach them. Rodriguez, Thompson, establish defensive perimeter, Sarah ordered. Brooks, get on the radio and update our situation to base operations. For the next 23 minutes, Phoenix 77's crew held their tiny defensive position while enemy forces searched the valley for their location. Sarah used her knowledge of helicopter operations to disable critical systems that could provide intelligence to enemy forces if the aircraft were captured. The rescue finally arrived in the form of 2 additional Black Hawks supported by Apache attack helicopters that cleared the valley of enemy forces. The extraction itself required another exceptional flying demonstration as the rescue pilots had to navigate the same treacherous approach that Sarah had used to reach the landing area. As Sarah and her crew were lifted out of the valley, she looked down at Phoenix 77 sitting damaged but intact in the tiny clearing where she had landed it. The aircraft would eventually be recovered and rebuilt, but the story of what had happened that day would become legendary throughout the military aviation community. Back at Forward Operating Base Chapman, word of Sarah's emergency landing spread quickly. Pilots who had initially questioned her abilities now sought her advice on advanced flying techniques. The special operations team she had supported began specifically requesting her for their most dangerous missions. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez called Sarah into his office the day after the emergency landing. "Chun, I've been flying helicopters for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did yesterday. That landing should have been impossible." Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the rookie pilot who had been laughed at during training to the combat veteran who had just completed an impossible emergency landing, every challenge had prepared her for that crucial test. "Sir, I think the landing was only possible because of everything I learned from people who doubted me," she said. "Every criticism made me work harder. Every obstacle forced me to find better solutions. Every failure taught me something I needed to know." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "The Flight Safety Board is going to investigate the incident, but they've already told me they're recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. More importantly, they want to use your emergency procedures as the basis for new training protocols." 6 months later, when Sarah's deployment to Afghanistan ended, she left behind a reputation as one of the finest helicopter pilots ever to serve in combat. The techniques she had developed were being taught to pilots throughout the military, and her story had become an inspiration to aviators facing their own challenges and doubts. But perhaps the most important legacy of that 7-minute emergency landing wasn't the awards or recognition. It was the proof that exceptional ability isn't determined by size, gender, or background, but by dedication, skill, and the refusal to accept limitations that others try to impose. The rookie pilot who had been laughed at had become the veteran aviator who redefined what was possible when skill meets determination under impossible circumstances. Phoenix 77 had landed safely, but Captain Sarah Chun had soared far beyond anything her critics had ever thought possible. Years later, when asked about that day in the mountains of Afghanistan, Sarah would always say the same thing. "The helicopter didn't land itself. But it also didn't land because I was trying to prove anyone wrong. It landed because my crew needed to get home safely, and that was the only thing that mattered." The laughter had stopped long ago, replaced by the quiet respect that exceptional professionals earn through their actions rather than their words. And, in flight schools around the world, instructors would tell the story of the pilot who proved that when everything goes wrong, extraordinary people find a way to make everything go right.